Alright, how's it going everybody? Welcome back to another episode. In this video, I'm going to do something I've never done before and try using some 35mm film in this medium format camera. As you can see here, I have it wound up and ready to go. And I have an adapter, a little plastic thing that will fit it in here, but I don't have it, so I'm not going to use it because I don't actually need it, because when I close it, it just helps keep it straight and positioned. But once I close it, it should just stay in the middle as long as I'm winding in the middle. So it's a little bit different process, and I figured out kind of how to do it. So the way this camera is aligned, it's a twin lens reflex camera, and it normally, if you're using medium format film, it shoots 6:6 aspect ratio, so it's square. And this 35mm film is 24:36 millimeters. And as you can see it here, I'm going to be shooting kind of like a panoramic, so it'll end up being 55:24 aspect ratio. And the entire film on 35mm is light sensitive, so you'll have an exposure over these little holes here as well. So that's kind of the aesthetic and look you get when you use 35mm film with a medium format camera. So yeah, it's kind of interesting that way, and the way it'll work out is also something that's different about the method and the process is when I close this, it starts at 0, and then I have to wind it a lot to get to frame 1 if I were shooting 35mm medium format film. But because I'm shooting 35mm film, I'm just gonna start from, I'm gonna wind it, and there's luckily this camera, this Ricohflex, has some little markings before you get to frame 1 that shows me it has 3 markings, so I can take 3 pictures, 3 exposures before I get to 1, and then it winds to 12, at which point I'll have 15 exposures. And then I'll put it into my dark bag, and I'll open it up and close it, which will set it to 0 again, and then I'll just keep winding it, so I'll have to keep track. And I calculated that with this aspect ratio, I can get 23 exposures. So normally with 35mm film, you get 36 exposures, but because I'm shooting 55 millimeters by 24mm, I calculated that I'll get about 23 exposures. So I'm just gonna keep track of it. So I just loaded it up. The problem with not having the little adapters here is that it'll hold it in place in the center, but as long as I have it wound in the center and it's ready to get wound up, it should just pull. This will kind of get caught right here, and then it'll pull in the middle. So there's a possibility that it'll move around side to side, which is bad. It'll kind of ruin my framing. Hopefully that all makes sense. It's just a little bit different process. And I think the process will be a little bit different depending on what camera you're using, but theoretically it should work. You can put any 35mm film into a medium format camera without an adapter. You just have to kind of calculate and figure out how to work it. So because this camera I'm using is 6:6, I get 12 shots, but if I was using, and it goes vertical, it winds the film from top to bottom. But if I was using a different camera, like a Pentax that moves the film from left to right, then you'll get a panoramic that's horizontal rather than vertical. And if you're using like a 645 or a 6.7, different cameras will give you different amounts of exposures. But I calculated with this one I'll get 23 exposures. So I'm just gonna test it out. I've never done this before, and we'll see how it goes. Hopefully, I'm just gonna drive around some neighborhoods and get some like street, city photography with some vertical panoramics that are 55 by 24 centimeters. So really long, and then you'll see the exposure over the holes as on the 35mm film as well. So let's get shooting and see how these turn out. So I loaded up my 35mm Portra 400 into this medium format twin lens reflex camera, and instead of winding to frame 1, I have these little markings. So this will be my first exposure. I'm just gonna count so I don't lose track. And then if you can see the viewfinder here, I'm going to just kind of imagine the middle. So I'll be cutting off these edges here and making my compositions with keeping in mind that my film is a lot shorter. It's 24mm rather than 55mm. So I'll just have to make sure that works out. Okay, we got this nice tulip yard in the middle. 1, 2, 3. All right, done. So let's wind it to the next one. Let's get another shot off. All right, so I've taken 3 exposures and now I'm on frame 1 on this camera. So I just have to make sure I keep track. So I'm gonna keep track and write them all down on my phone, just each exposure I take. And once I get to 12, this camera ends. I'm gonna put this camera into my dark bag, open it and close it in the dark bag. That way the film doesn't get, exposed to light. But then it'll go back to 0 and I can kind of start over. But I know that I have 23 exposures. So once I get to 23, then I'll put the camera in my dark bag and wind the film all the way up, take it to the lab to get developed, and we'll see how they turn out. So it's overcast, which really soft light. There's no shadows. Not my ideal situation, but I'm gonna try and get some cool shots either way. So I'm trying to, normally I'd be up close with my 6x6 aspect ratio, but because I have to cut half of it off, I'm gonna move away to get the whole hoop and frame. Dude, look at this. Make sure you go past your elbows so the light can get in. So my camera's in this dark bag, which means no light can get into it. And I've just got to feel around. Open the back, close it again. Make sure it's closed. That was it. Just open and close it. That way, this just helps me, you know, keep track of each slide and frame evenly. So it progresses from one exposure to the next evenly. So now it's back on 0. So I just have to keep track. I've taken 15 exposures. I'll wind it till I see a little marking. That's the next one. That'll be 16, and so on and so forth till I get to 23. Because I've calculated with this aspect ratio, I have 23 exposures using 35 millimeter film. Yeah. So let's get going. It's getting dark. I'm trying to finish all these exposures off before the light gets down too low, too dark. And I'm just counting kind of every time I take one until I get to 23. And then I'll put the camera back in my dark bag and take the roll out and roll it up, and then take it to the lab and see how they end up looking. And then based on how they look, maybe there's some light leaks, maybe they're all blank for some reason. I'll have to think about any issues and try again. But this is my first time trying 35 millimeter without an adapter, just straight into medium format film or medium format camera. But these neighborhoods are pretty cool. There's some like interesting, a lot of these houses are different. They all have some kind of unique style about them. So I'm just trying to capture some of that style in a vertical. I guess I said panoramic before. It's not a panoramic. Technically panoramic is horizontal, but similar panoramic aspect ratio except vertical. So yeah, I think it's cool style. Plus you'll see the film will be exposed over the little holes in the 35 millimeter film, which is unique in that regard. Look at that cool truck. Let's go take a picture of it. Come on, 19. Uh-oh. It's not winding anymore. So that means I'm out of film. So I went to 19, but I'm short because I had to put a lot of film in to like get it wound. So I kind of, you know, skipped a lot of exposures at the beginning because I'm trying to wind it, but it's stuck, which tells me that it's at the end. So I'm gonna put it in my dark bag and wind it up. Hopefully it turned out. I'm glad I was able to get this last exposure though, because I think it'll look really cool. And yeah, I put a lot of film in the wheel and wound it up so that it would catch, and then it had a lot coming over the frame before I could actually close it. Because if you shoot medium format film, you wind a ton before you get to frame 1 because there's a lot of lead paper, like a lot of paper before you actually get to the film to get to frame 1, just because that's how the cameras are built. You wrap it up, wind it a ton. With 35 millimeter, as soon as you load it, you wind it 3 times and it's ready to go. But the 35 millimeter film is light sensitive from the very beginning. So that's the end. I got to 19 exposures. All right, so I think my calculation was pretty dead on as far as theoretically I would have 23 exposures, except I had to put a lot of the film, I had to put it through the spool and wind it a bit and then drag it down before I closed it, so there was a lot of film kind of wasted at the beginning. So I ended up getting 19 exposures. And I didn't use an adapter that keeps the film centered. It's just kind of loose in there. So when I take the roll out of the camera and roll it up right now, I'm going to just kind of see where the roll is in it. Hopefully, I assume it's mostly in the middle though, but some of the compositions might be a little off to the left or right, maybe even a little crooked. Shouldn't be crooked though, because it should pull it really straight. Anyway, it's my first time just sticking a 35mm roll into a medium format camera. Alright, I'm opening the camera now. Now I'm going to roll the film back up. So yeah, I think it'll work out. Theoretically, I did everything right as far as using 35mm film in a medium format camera. I use this twin lens reflex that pulls film vertically, so you get that vertical aspect ratio, which is pretty unique and different, and I think pretty fun to use, especially for like some street photography. All right, I got it. Bing! There it is. And I wound it all the way up, but that's okay, because the lab can pop this open and get it out. So there's my roll. Let me pull this camera out. Yeah, no light should have been getting in there. All right, so hopefully you got some insight into using 35mm film with a medium format twin lens reflex camera. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you do, give it a thumbs up, subscribe for future videos, comment below if you've ever shot 35mm film in a medium format camera, what kind of camera you used, and a bit about your process. To share some of your thoughts in the comments. And thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.